It was the war that divided nations, tore families apart, and changed history forever, a war fought not only in the jungles of Vietnam but also in the hearts and minds of millions. It was a conflict that would define a generation, leaving scars that are still felt today. To understand the Vietnam War, we must travel back to the end of World War II. In 1945, after decades of French colonial rule, a wave of hope swept across Vietnam. Led by the charismatic Ho Chi Minh, a movement known as the Viet Minh declared independence. For a brief moment, it seemed a new era of freedom had dawned. But this dream of a unified independent nation was short-lived. The world was quickly dividing into two camps, communist and anti-communist, East and West. The Cold War had begun. France, unwilling to let go of its colony, fought to regain control, sparking the First Indochina War. As the conflict raged, Vietnam was formally split in 1954. In the north, Ho Chi Minh established a communist government backed by China and the Soviet Union. In the south, a fragile anti-communist government was formed, supported by the United States. America's involvement started small, with financial aid and a handful of military advisors. The goal was simple: to prevent communism from spreading. This fear was guided by a powerful idea known as the domino theory. Us leaders, from President Eisenhower to Kennedy, believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries in Southeast Asia would topple one by one, like a row of dominoes. This theory justified a slow but steady escalation. More money, more weapons, and more American advisors poured into South Vietnam. The line between advising and fighting began to blur. Then, in August 1964, a pivotal moment occurred in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. Reports claimed that North Vietnamese patrol boats had launched an unprovoked attack on American destroyers. While the details of the incident remain debated to this day, the political impact was immediate and immense. Citing this aggression, President Lyndon B. Johnson secured near-unanimous approval from Congress to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against U.S. forces. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution opened the floodgates. It wasn't a formal declaration of war, but it gave the president the power to wage one. America was no longer just an advisor. It was about to become a direct combatant. The path to full-scale war was now tragically clear. The American war machine roared to life. Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive and sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, began in 1965. On the ground, hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed. They were young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, sent to fight in an unfamiliar land, a world of dense jungles, suffocating heat, and rice paddies. They weren't fighting a conventional army on a clear battlefield. Their enemy was the Viet Cong, a guerrilla force deeply embedded within the local population. They were farmers by day and fighters by night. The war had no front lines. Danger was everywhere. Hidden booby traps, surprise ambushes, and a landscape that was as much an enemy as the soldiers hiding within it. The American strategy became a brutal war of attrition, to kill more of the enemy than they could replace. The measure of success wasn't territory gained, but the grim metric of the body count. This brutal logic led to immense destruction. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were burned, and the line between combatant and civilian became tragically blurred. In the midst of this chaos, unthinkable atrocities occurred. In March 1968, American soldiers entered the village of My Lai and killed hundreds of unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. The event was covered up for over a year, but when the truth emerged, it sent shockwaves across the globe, exposing the darkest depths of the conflict and staining America's moral authority. For the soldiers on the ground, the psychological toll was immense. They fought a war where victory was elusive and the purpose was increasingly unclear, all while the people they were meant to be saving often saw them as invaders. Then came 1968, a year that would change everything. As the Vietnamese people prepared to celebrate Tet, their new year, the war was supposed to quiet down. Instead, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. This was the Tet Offensive. Fierce fighting erupted in the streets of Saigon, where Viet Cong commandos even breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy. The ancient imperial capital of Hue was engulfed in a brutal house-to-house battle that lasted for weeks. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the Communists. They suffered devastating losses and failed to hold any of their primary targets. But politically and psychologically, it was a stunning victory for them. For years, the American public had been told by their government and military leaders that the enemy was on the brink of collapse, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Tet shattered that illusion. Suddenly, the war wasn't in some distant jungle. It was on television screens in every American living room. News anchors like Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, returned from Vietnam and declared the war a stalemate. If America couldn't protect its own embassy, how could it possibly win the war? The credibility gap between what the government was saying and what people were seeing had become a chasm. The Tet Offensive broke the will of the American public and turned the tide of the war not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the people back home. As the body bags returned and the truth of the war became harder to ignore, America fractured. The anti-war movement, which had started on college campuses, exploded into a massive nationwide force. Hundreds of thousands of people marched on Washington, chanting for peace. Young men burned their draft cards in public acts of defiance. The counterculture embraced protest, with songs from artists like John Lennon and Bob Dylan becoming anthems for a generation that refused to stay silent. The movement wasn't just made up of students and hippies. Respected leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., spoke out powerfully against the war, calling it an unjust conflict that disproportionately sent poor and minority soldiers to die. The division tore the country apart. It pitted parents against children, hawks who supported the war against doves who demanded peace. The political chaos peaked in 1968, a year of riots, assassinations, and a deeply contested presidential election. Richard Nixon won the presidency with a promise of peace with honor and a secret plan to end the war. His strategy was Vietnamization, a policy of gradually withdrawing American troops and transferring responsibility for the fighting to the South Vietnamese army. But as U.S. troops began to come home, the war expanded into neighboring Cambodia, sparking even more outrage. In May 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, National Guardsmen opened fire on students protesting the Cambodian invasion, killing 4 and wounding 9. The tragedy symbolized just how deeply the war had wounded America itself. The nation was at war not only in Vietnam but with itself. By 1973, after years of painstaking negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. A ceasefire was declared and the last American combat troops finally left Vietnam. For the U.S., the war was over. But for the Vietnamese, the fighting continued. Without the massive support of the American military, the South Vietnamese army struggled to hold back the relentless advance from the north. In the spring of 1975, the end came swiftly. The North Vietnamese army launched a final, decisive offensive. The South Vietnamese defenses crumbled. The world watched in disbelief as chaos engulfed Saigon. Desperate evacuations began. Haunting images were broadcast globally. Crowds of people scaling the walls of the U.S. Embassy, begging for a spot on the last helicopters out. These were the final, iconic moments of America's long and bitter war. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The city was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The war was finally over. Vietnam was unified under communist rule. After 30 years of conflict, the cost was staggering. Over 58,000 Americans had died. But the toll on the Vietnamese people was catastrophic, with estimates of over 3 million dead, both soldiers and civilians. A generation was lost and a land was left scarred and poisoned. The legacy of the Vietnam War is complex and painful. American veterans returned home not to parades, but to a divided country that often met them with indifference or hostility. Many struggled for years with post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by what they had seen and done. In Vietnam, the landscape itself bears the scars. Millions of unexploded bombs still litter the countryside, a deadly reminder of the past. The chemical defoliant Agent Orange, sprayed by the U.S. to destroy jungle cover, caused birth defects that have affected generations. Yet, amidst the tragedy, there is also a story of incredible resilience. Today, Vietnam is a vibrant, thriving country. Its cities are bustling, its economy is growing, and its people look toward the future. The scars remain, but they have not defined them. The war taught the world hard lessons about the limits of military power, the dangers of political deceit, and the profound human cost of conflict. The Vietnam War was not just fought with weapons, it was fought with beliefs, fear, and hope. Its echoes still remind us that war, no matter how justified, always costs humanity dearly. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Let history remind us, but never repeat itself.